In today's reading from Matthew 14 to 16, Jesus makes it very clear that to follow him is to trust him and to be wholeheartedly devoted to him. Chapter 14 begins with the death of John the Baptist, someone who lived his life for only one reason, to point other people to Jesus. That's the reason for which he lived, and ultimately, that's the reason for which he died. And then we get two examples of Jesus inviting his disciples to trust him fully. First, Jesus is teaching, and there's a crowd of thousands of people, and the disciples say, "Lord, these people are hungry. How are we going to feed them?" And Jesus says, "You give them something to eat." Now, of course, Jesus knew that they themselves couldn't do it, but he was teaching them a lesson that they would need to understand and rely on throughout their lives and ministries. And so he gave them an opportunity here to look to him, to trust him, to work through them in order to give life to people who are hungry for it. And they didn't understand what he was saying, but he showed them. He took a couple of fish and a few loaves of bread, and he multiplied it so that a crowd of hungry people could be fed. After that, the disciples are in a boat on a stormy sea, and Jesus comes walking to them on the water. He calls Peter to come to him, and at first Peter trusts him. Peter's actually walking on the water, but then he looks around and sees the waves and the wind, and he gets scared, and he starts to sink, and he prays the shortest prayer in history, "Lord, help." And look what Jesus does. He doesn't just save Peter, he gives Peter another opportunity to trust him. He takes him by the hand and says, "Why did you doubt me?" In other words, "Peter, you can trust me." And then they got into the boat. But wait a minute, how did they get back to the boat? They had to walk together. They didn't just arrive in the boat, they had to go back together. Peter trusting Jesus and Jesus enabling Peter. In chapter 15, the Pharisees are at their business again. Rather than being amazed at the news that Jesus had multiplied a few loaves of bread and made it enough to feed more than 5,000 people, they instead focused on criticizing the disciples of Jesus because they didn't wash their hands properly before they ate bread. And Jesus tells his disciples, these religious guys, they think they're honoring God with all of their high-sounding words, with their commitment to do all of these religious rituals and appear to be so holy. But don't miss this. Jesus notices that they're committed to teaching God's word. Jesus notices that they're dedicated to serving God and working for God, just like many of you are. But hard work for Jesus and great words about Jesus don't prove anything, because even though the Pharisees were so devoted to doing things for God, Jesus reveals what their real position before God actually was. And he does it by quoting a passage from the prophet Isaiah, which we saw in yesterday's reading. He says, "These people honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far away from me. And their religion and their worship," he says, "is absolutely useless." And then he goes on to explain to his disciples that they need to focus not on cleaning up the outside, not on working for God on the outside, all of the externals and hard work and effort, but they need to focus on the inside, allowing God to change their hearts, to give them hearts that belong fully to him. And immediately we see an example of what he's talking about. A Canaanite woman comes to Jesus and asks him to heal her daughter. Now, every Jew knew that Canaanites were wicked. They were ungodly and completely outside the possibility of receiving God's love and acceptance. In other words, who she was on the outside disqualified her from knowing God. But look how Jesus sees things. The Pharisees, who were pure on the outside, were rebuked by Jesus, and they said, "These people are not right with God." This Canaanite woman, who was impure on the outside, was commended by Jesus because inside, he said, she has great faith. Well, after multiplying bread and feeding yet another hungry crowd, and I'm sure that the disciples didn't wash their hands properly, Jesus shows his disciples in chapter 16 what it means to have a heart that really loves and trusts and belongs to them. He tells them that pretty soon he's going to be arrested and beaten and killed. And Peter pulls him aside and says, "No way, Lord. Something like that can never happen to someone like you." And Jesus tells Peter that he's not thinking God's thoughts, but he's thinking the thoughts of man, because man thinks about protecting himself, about doing everything so that he is safe and so that everything's good in his life. But Jesus says anybody who wants to belong to me has to think differently. He has to do what I do. He has to deny himself, and take up his cross daily, in other words, continually lay down his life for me and follow me, to go where I go, to do what I do, to live for the same reason that I live. Anybody, he says, who protects themselves, who lives to build their own kingdom, is going to lose their life. But anybody, he says, who loses their life and gives themselves fully for my sake is the one who will truly find his life forever. You can gain the whole world, Jesus says, but that won't get you anything. You can do all kinds of religious things and work for God and impress everybody in the church, but Jesus says that will gain you nothing. When we stand before the Father one day, only one thing will matter. Did you have a heart that belonged to him? Did you have a heart that trusted him? Did you have a heart that delighted in him? Did you have a heart that was wholeheartedly devoted to him?